Hey, I'm Justin.
This is Chaz.
Join us as we look back together, but learn to stay present.
Come with us as we rise up with hope on the horizon.
This is the podcast of extraordinary millennial gentlemen.
And then, anyway, why don't you, fill me in on some of the details on your side. And then I've got some other experiences later in life also with some friends and stuff, but.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So 2 months old, 2 to 3 months old in your experience. So mine involves my son, my youngest, and he was born C-section, like all my kids. My wife is amazing, went through that. And normal stay in the hospital to recover for that. Healthy boy, comes home, doing great. My mother-in-law is still in town. He's like 2 weeks old to the day, and he starts running a really high fever. He starts getting shallow of breath and doesn't want to eat. So it kind of starts with that fussiness.
Yeah. And
then it proceeds to a temperature that keeps rising. You know, he's 99, he's 100, he's 101, he's 102. He's not becoming very responsive. And so there's no indication of this, everybody. Yeah. It's not like a week coming or anything like that. It was like within a few hours.
Right.
So
very quick.
I'm at work. My wife calls me, and I'm not speaking purely as a parent, but just anybody, right? Anybody who's got a loved one or a friend. In this case, I was a parent going through this with a newborn, but I'm sitting at work just like, wow, everything is great. And you get that phone call that's like, we're on our way to the emergency room. Something is wrong. We don't know what, but your son's unresponsive. It's like, right. Yeah. So the crisis and the chaos are pretty much immediate. Right. And there's a level of shock for me that I, have to go into our office and say, I need to go. I've got a medical emergency and I don't know what's going on and I don't know when I'll be back.
Right.
And great credit to my team I worked with and my employer was just like, go, we're good. Just go. Yeah. Right. It was a really long drive to the hospital. It wasn't distance wise, but you're not listening to the radio. You're driving really fast. So I was your dad, right? I was your dad.
Oh, yeah.
And that moment I was flying. And at the same time, I'm just talking, right? I'm talking to God. I'm talking to myself. Yeah. I'm trying to prepare myself for something, and we don't know what's wrong, but it's not looking good. Get to the emergency room. My son's in triage. He's not responsive. He's tiny. He's 2 weeks old.
Yeah.
The triage doctor who's in the ER, this is like in the afternoons, probably 1 or 2 in the afternoon. And she says, you know what? I really want to test his spinal fluid and give him a lumbar and see if we can get a sample out of there, because the way his heart rate was, jumping, he wasn't eating at that point. He hadn't eaten for hours. And for a baby, you start to dehydrate very quickly. He was overheating. His temperature was up to 103. So it was like, okay, we need to start getting some diagnostics ASAP. And that is just excruciating to watch. That procedure. So that's really the first thing that kicked in once I was in the hospital, is just dawning that this is your child. This is I would equate it to just innocence that just does not deserve to go through that difficulty. Right. And they get through that test and everything is just, we didn't sit down for hours. We just stood there, my wife and I, and are just, shaking basically. So you go from shock to going into just insane levels of fear and doubt. And at that point with the medical crisis, you start to put your hope onto individual results, right?
Yeah.
All the way down to like getting a temperature, like watching heart rate. He's hooked up all over, and you're looking at everything, and you're like, what does that mean? What does that mean? I think that's good. Is that bad? What does that mean? So that fast acting triage doctor said, you know what? The sample came back a little bit cloudy, and we are going to get it through the labs, but we recommend that you get to a different hospital that can treat him as soon as possible. Right.
Oh, wow.
And so we go from our local hospital into downtown Baltimore. It was either Johns Hopkins or University of Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're not talking about, a small institution or even one that's not really well known. Right.
Yeah. Either.
The shorter drive was to University of Maryland. So we're like, let's go there. So they took him in an ambulance because that would get there quicker. Get to the University of Maryland. He's in the pediatric intensive care unit. We're 5 or 6 hours in.
Wow.
No food, no water. You are not thinking about yourself. And I have 2 kids at home. My mother-in-law is wrangling them, but my mother-in-law had to have been going just distraught, right?
Yeah.
Not knowing what was going on. So that's a major added burden is how do you communicate, right? You let people know that there's an emergency and you ask for their support, but you don't know what you need.
Oh no. Yeah.
And you have this burden of communicating and trying to convey properly what's going on. And, when you're going through that fear and those doubts, your emotions are just piling up and getting heavier and heavier.
Yeah.
I'll not go through every step of this, right?
Sure.
But so my son ended up living, which I'm very grateful for. We're so happy about. He had amazing care while he was at University of Maryland Hospital, and he was in the pediatric intensive care unit, and it was day to day for about 4 days. He was not out of the woods. He started to have seizures. And so that meningitis was, again, the body attacking itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it was complicated because they couldn't get a solid IV in him to try and keep him hydrated, as well as deliver the antibiotics that they were really trying to get in. 2 weeks old, veins are tiny. I mean, I learned so much about medical procedures and the role of a nurse, and they had people who were incredibly specialized in experience with extremely small needles trying to make this happen. I think my son, just in the time that in the days that I was there, I don't know. I don't think I'm exaggerating saying he was, poked or IV attempted, 50 or 60 times. Eventually what they were able to do, it was like getting a little bit of fluid, and then the vein would close up. Right. And that was a constant.
Yep.
When he started to get a little more hydrated, about 24 hours, 48 hours in, they were able to get a PICC line in. And a PICC line is where they go through a major artery in your shoulder and go through your chest. And so they have a much larger gauge needle. And when they do that, they essentially have to put your arm in a sling and keep your arm extended. And he's 2 weeks old. Yeah. You know what I mean? They're fidgety. They don't want to stay still. So he really started to turn a corner once that PICC line got in. But I also think the antibiotics were starting to get narrowed down. They were starting to get more specific on the therapy. And for anybody who is aware, meningitis, once you're starting to get on the favorable side of the numbers, you just have to have that precise strain that you're dealing with fairly well identified, because you can't just go broad spectrum antibiotic and hope something works.
Right.
Like you said, you're really dealing with very specific bacteria that is telling your body to do very specific things, which is largely attack itself. Right.
Yeah.
And so he, it was brutal. The first 2 days were, is he going to make it?
Yeah.
He made it. He had so much swelling in his brain. It was actually a great blessing, if that's the right word. It was as good as could be expected that his cranium and his skull wasn't fully formed.
Oh.
And so the swelling on his brain actually had some room, right?
Yeah.
Rather than having, that sealed skull. That can happen later in life. That can be a very serious complication.
Oh, yeah.
And that swelling of the brain can result in permanent damage. So that swelling centered in his brain. It was really attacking his spine and central nervous. It was staying there. It wasn't really going to his limbs. So there were a lot of things that were like, wow, okay, this is better than it could be. But until he got that IV line in, he really wasn't responsive. And it's just like everything has a monitor and a beep and a sound, and you're living like one beep, one test at a time. And so he went from going through just, is he going to live, to, what are the ramifications of these seizures? Can we get those seizures to slow down, to try and get those under control? And those started to come, those seizures started to subside as that swelling started to subside a little bit. And he, probably a week into that pediatric intensive care unit, was starting to look like he could be moved. He could go to just kind of a recovery room.
Yeah.
He was starting to eat, but he was just hooked up to everything. And it was kind of, it's a weird thing to laugh about now, but when all he had was a fever, like a weekend, it was like, who cares? He's been through everything. He's had multiple lumbars. He's had EKGs. He's had seizures. He's literally had his whole head wrapped in sensors and monitors, because unlike a person who's more fully developed or communicate, you have no sign that they're seizing. It's a 2-week-old baby, right?
Yeah.
So he had to be constantly monitored with that. So it was like, here's this bionic boy, robotic in terms of more machine than man, kind of keeping him going.
He's the new cyborg.
That's right. So he's slowly, those mechanisms that were monitoring him and assisting him slowly as he improved could be reduced to the point that he just had a PICC line and a fever. And that was like, man, this is the best day ever. But it was full crisis mode. I would say the whole ordeal from initial admittance to the emergency room to taking him home was about 3.5 weeks. Wow. So he was in the hospital for that longer than he'd been alive at that point. I know that's a lot, and that was kind of long-winded, but that was some high-level detail.
Hey, thanks for spending some time with us today. Hope you find hope and joy throughout this upcoming week. If you've liked this podcast, please hit the subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, and we'll see you next week.
I ate my grandma.